Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is July 9th, and yesterday was the 500th day of the Russia-Ukraine war, which is absolutely crazy because I remember February 24th when the war broke out. I remember seeing the footage of the strikes. I remember seeing the footage from that security camera of the Ukrainian border guards blowing up the bridges as Russian troops began to cross the border from Crimea into Kherson. And one thing that is really memorable in the collective conscious of all of us is Russia's attack on Snake Island and then the surrender of those Ukrainian soldiers over there. And so, speaking of Snake Island, Zelensky actually landed on that island yesterday and he released this very interesting PR video where he actually writes Slava Ukraini on the sign of the island, and he just films a video over there. Obviously, it's a PR stunt, but still indicates that the Ukrainians in this area around Snake Island and in a lot of the Black Sea region are at no threat of being hit by the Russians, which shows a major shift in really the capabilities of the Russians in this region, where before the beginning of the war, the Russians had control over Snake Island, and their navy, their Black Sea fleet, was really roaming around the entirety of the sea over here, and they were able to actually fire onto the Ukrainian coast around Odessa, and there was this entire fear that Russia would end up launching attacks from Snake Island onto Odessa. Once that became unrealistic, the Russians withdrew, and now their fleet isn't even that close to Ukraine's coast in Mykolaiv or in Odessa or in some parts of Kherson, for instance, simply because of the grain deal. And it does show a shift in the conflict in how a lot of the fighting is just really relegated to certain parts of Ukraine, especially in the south and the east, as we're going to be talking about today. So let's begin with Zaporizhzhia today. And so, in this direction, the Ukrainians continue to hold on to Pyatikhatki, and they are now conducting troop rotations after some of the units that were responsible for taking over the town originally fought over here for weeks and suffered some significant casualties. They're being rotated out for new units that will continue the forward assaults in the direction of Zherebianki. So the two units that will be rotated towards the front line are the 117th and the 118th mechanized brigades, which are located around here somewhere. Let me try to find them because I know that they're in this area. Here you have the 118th, and here you have the 117th. So they're going to be moved closer towards Pyatikhatki to help continue the Ukrainian offensive in this area. Now, further to the east, the Ukrainians around Robotyne have actually been able to achieve minor success. Let's look at the extent of their gains. They were able to pierce the Russian line and advance about zero point 0.5 miles. And so they took over this entire polygon that I'm going to go over here in blue. Here you can see. And so this, first of all, indicates that the Ukrainians have full control over the nature reserve Balka Uspanivska. And the front line has shifted a bit to the south, and the Ukrainians took over one bush line where Russian fort positions were stationed. And so they were able to pierce this line on July 8th, but the Russian 771st Motor Rifle Regiment, which is located in Robotyne, they were able to put a stop to the Ukrainian advances. There were firefights all day, and the Ukrainian attacks in this direction were stalled due to heavy rain, which really made it difficult for reinforcements and resupply to come in. And so this is the situation, just a very small bulge. And again, the goal here is pretty obvious for Ukraine. It's to reach this road. I don't know if you could see it, this road over here. And then from there to try to flank Robotyne from the northeast in this direction. And then pierce the town because they were unsuccessful in piercing it directly from the north or from the northwest a couple of days ago. And so that's it for Zaporizhzhia. Moving forward to the east, around Velyka Novosilka, we do have some significant changes to the map. The Ukrainians have been able to advance in the direction of Pryudyne from Novodarivka and Rivnopil, and they took over generally the area that I have marked in blue. And so let's look at the distances actually for how much they advanced in this direction. Perhaps about 1.2 miles. That was the full extent of their advances in this direction. And what they took over was, first of all, some fields that were in between Pryutyne and Rivnopil. But in terms of the geography, they were able to take over a valley, which again is located at a very low elevation compared to the heights to the north over here in the square, because that area is on higher ground, and also compared to the Russian positions around Pryutnia, which are also on higher ground. And so this is Pryutnia, and then to the east you have all of these fields, and you do have some pretty significant heights over here compared to the valley, which Ukraine has now been able to take control over. And so it was probably very hard for the Russians to maintain their forward positions within this valley, which is why they fell back towards their heights to the south. And now Ukraine has control over several bush lines that run through this valley, low elevated valley, and also have control over some lakes in this area. There's some pretty minor lakes. If you want to get a good idea of the elevation, here's the valley that I'm referring to. You could see how it's, about 400 feet above sea level. And to the north, the Ukrainians have control of the heights, and then to the south, the Russians also have control of heights to the east of Pryutnia. And you could see that the valleys, they sort of run into the town of Pryutnia from the northwest, and there's also another valley which sort of pushes into the Russian line in some of the open fields. And so throughout those entire valleys, you have these bush lines that extend throughout the entire valley, which could potentially be used by Ukraine to infiltrate into the town of Pryutnia. This has been a strategy that they've used several times to advance in different directions, sending in these small groups through valleys, these very small groups that are trying to use the forests and use the tree belts as concealment as they advance. And so perhaps they're going to do the same thing here once they take control of the two valleys that I have marked in red over here, these two, to infiltrate into Pryutnia, because we know that they're already attacking Pryutnia from the north with this blue arrow, and then also from the west from Levadnya. So let's move on to the Bakhmut sector, where we're going to be talking about Klishivka and about Mrkivka. In the Klishivka direction, the Ukrainians were able to conduct a counterattack of their own. I know in the last video I talked about Russian counterattack, but now it's a Ukrainian counterattack, and the Ukrainians have been able to advance about zero point 0.2 miles in some areas, and they were able to, first of all, maintain control over the heights which they took over the past week. And if you want to know where these heights are located, it's in this general blue square, about 750 feet above sea level, versus the Russian positions in Klishivka, which are about 500 feet above sea level. And so the Ukrainians, they advanced zero point 0.2 miles in this area, secured full control over this trench system over here, and also got control of the bush line that runs adjacent to this road, in which I'm marking with this rectangle. And so there was another trench line that was positioned over there, and there was another fortified position which we took over here in this rectangle which I've marked. And so you can see that a lot of this is really small scale fighting for local strongholds, which you need as stepping stones to advance further deep into either side's lines. And so now Ukraine has been able to solidify control over these local strong points, and their aim will be to continue pushing west as it did a few days ago towards the different forested patches to the west of Klishivka, where they were never able to fully infiltrate these forested areas. So that will definitely be their goal going into the coming days. But moving to the north, the Ukrainians are also conducting attacks in the direction of Berkivka. And so you can see that this square is about what they were able to gain over the past few days in terms of what's solidly under control. So that would mean that they got control over some positions and fields adjacent to the rail line and adjacent to different minor roads. So they got control of some pretty large bush lines in this area and advanced, zero point 0.6 miles. And you could say their advances were even larger because they reached the southwestern corner of Berkivka, which means that they nearly advanced a mile in this direction. And so for a certain period of time yesterday, they were able to set up positions in the southwestern part of Berkivka. And again, this is a very small scale attack by the Ukrainians, mainly by the 77th Air Mobile Assault Brigade and the 57th Motorized Brigade. And so they set up positions in some of these houses, which are heavily damaged by the course of the war and all the shelling, but they're still good positions to try to hide yourself in. And so the Russians, Specifically, in this case, it would be the 98th Guards Airborne Division. They noticed these Ukrainian troops infiltrating into the town, and so they fired a pretty heavy artillery barrage and were able to overrun the Ukrainian positions, kill some of them, and then take a couple of Ukrainian troops as POWs. And so now the front line is sort of stabilized towards the southern part, just to the south of Berkivka. And so now the distance between Berkivka and the front line is about 1,000 feet. So not that much. And the Ukrainians are still trying to push in that direction in order to infiltrate the Russian lines and cut off the northern flank into Bakhmut and all the supply lines associated with it. Now, before I end the video, it's important to talk about the new weapons shipment, which was announced by the United States Department of Defense, which will be given to Ukraine. Now, this is sort of something that regularly happens now. Here's just a list of the different weaponry which will be provided to Ukraine. Now, this is nothing special. These weapons have already been provided to Ukraine in the past, and they will continue to be provided. Really, the point is that the Americans are continuing to resupply the Ukrainians wherever they have a certain deficiency. So if they're losing a high amount of infantry fighting vehicles, then they're being replenished by the Americans in order to continue with their counteroffensive. So this, first of all, gives us insight into what Ukraine intends to do in the future, but also into what they're losing a large amount of weaponry in. And so, just in terms of some key highlights from this weapons package, I would say getting the more munitions for Patriot air defense systems and also getting more ammo for HIMARS. That's pretty important. But we've been hearing about this really for months now. New ammo for both these systems. No new additional shipments of either system. So Ukrainians still have the same amount of HIMARS systems and Patriot air defense systems, but they're getting more ammunition for it. So this indicates to me that the Ukrainians are not suffering from a shortage of these systems, but they just need more ammo in order to fire onto the Russian rear. Now, another interesting thing is the shipment of the fighting vehicles and the Striker armored personnel carriers. Again, this is meant to be sent to the Zaporizhzhia front to help continue with the armored columns that are trying to break through in towns like Robotyne that we talked about before. You know, javelins, again, pretty standard, trying to fight against the Russian tanks and the Russian vehicles that are trying to counter the Ukrainian columns. And then again, it's just small arms, additional rounds, more howitzers, artillery rounds. And then the thing that is the most important out of this entire announcement is the DPICM. So, what are those? Those are dual purpose, improved conventional munitions. And that basically means that they're cluster munitions. And Americans have a vast, vast stockpile of these cluster munitions. And the thing about them is that are these canisters that have really, in some cases, hundreds of small submunitions that they get released and dispersed right before the munition or canister hits the ground. And so it creates a whole lot of damage over a pretty wide array of an area. And so just to give some perspective, the DPICMs, which are the type of cluster munition that America is giving the Ukrainians, those ones, they have about 88 submunitions per canister, and the lethal range for a single one of those submunitions is 10 square meters, which is crazy because when you think of it, there's 88 per canister, so that could be tens of thousands of square meters per each canister. And then you think, how many canisters does America really have? Well, there are sources that say that their stockpiles have up to 5.5 million different cluster munitions, and that includes 728.3 million submunitions. And so America really has a huge amount of supplies of these cluster bombs, and they're not using them because they have been removed from America's active utilization since 2016. And so America doesn't really have an incentive to hold onto them anymore, and they've already started sending them, so that chip is crossed already. And so they could begin sending really millions of these to Ukraine. Now, I'm not saying they're going to give all 5.5 million. Maybe not all of them are in the best standard, or maybe America wants to keep some of them for themselves just in case for the future. But Still, if they were to give all 5.5 million, they could use 15,000 of those canisters on a daily basis, and that would be able to sustain the Ukrainian artillery across the entire front line for the entire year, for the next 365 days. That's assuming that they would spend all of that within a year, but they could spread it out more evenly across a couple of years. And again, this is just one type of munition. Ukrainians have obviously other types of munitions that they're utilizing. And so this is going to be a great solution for the Ukrainians in terms of their artillery shortage. Now, the issue is the amount of time that it takes for this to get shipped, obviously. This is not going to reach the front lines in a day. And so the Ukrainians really need to work on improving their supply lines if they want to really get the most out of these shipments. And so it's not going to be any sort of game changer, I don't think. I just think that it's going to strengthen the Ukrainians in some areas where they have a weak point, and it's going to help them continue to sustain their defense on certain axes and their attack on other axes. So, for instance, Zaporizhzhia, you could say that if the cluster munitions are being fired from the 155 millimeter howitzers, they have a range of about 29 kilometers or about 18 miles. Let's try to measure that actually. What's 18 miles on the front line? So you can see the 18 miles, it obviously means that the cluster munitions would be within the effective range of the first Russian line of defense, and also close to some of the rear defenses, some of the second and third lines of defense around major cities like Tokmak, which is a city over here, key supply hub, or like this town over here, Ocherutwavdve, or Polohi. That one is very close to the front line, and so that will be hit extensively. Also, Bilmak, and so these cluster munitions, they could cause some significant damage to the Russian personnel in these areas and also to their vehicles, because you really need about 10 or more submunitions to destroy a certain armored vehicle, but really even one could be enough to disable some of its weaponry or to render it immobile. And so this presents a big benefit for Ukraine in their operations on the Zaporizhzhia front. Not saying that's any sort of magic pill. Like a lot of Ukrainian sources throughout the entire course of the war, they've been hyping up Patriot air defense systems and HIMARS like it's going to change the entire course of the war. Obviously, that's not what I'm saying, but I do think that it will obviously be a huge addition to their arsenal, especially because of the fact that America has millions of them. So just imagine how many will be sent in the coming months. So that'll be very interesting to see. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.